Welcome, everyone. Thank you for lasting this long. I hope we've saved the best for last. My name is Patrick Doherty, and I'm the director of the Smart Strategy Initiative here at New America, and I work closely with Peter and Steve and the whole team on counterterrorism in South Asia. The purpose of this panel is really to integrate much of the material that has already come earlier in the day. We're here to think about the challenges in Afghanistan through a regional lens and also through a whole of government, whole of society lens, to look at the big picture. And the question before the panel is really to narrow it a little bit. What are the necessary precursors to Afghan reconciliation? Where do we stand today, and where do we go from here? We've already heard much about the state of the insurgency, the interests of the regional neighbors, and we all know there is no military solution to the various wars raging inside Afghanistan, and that some form of layered political deal will be necessary. But what are the operational implications for international efforts in this arena? And if we take a broader view of the South Asia regional context, one in which India, China, Iran, and the rest of the neighbors are actively engaged in promoting stability and economic integration, what new solutions may be possible? So, to keep this moving fast, I'm not going to go into the deep bios of this extraordinary panel we have, but I will just give you the rundown. We will start with Claire Lockhart, who leads the Institute for State Effectiveness. And she will first frame out the big picture for Afghanistan, reconciliation in Afghanistan, and then will give us a window into the state of the Afghan state, how much work really does need to be done before Afghanistan is ready for reconciliation as a real partner for the international community and the regional neighbors for stability. Then we will turn to Bijan Kian, member of the board of directors of the U.S. Export-Import Bank. And Director Kian will talk about the economics of Afghanistan and get into a proposal for Afghan-led economic development that was adopted by last June's Peace Jirga in Kabul. Following Director Kian, we will look at the talks, to the extent there are talks, with the Taliban from two well-informed practitioners, Michael Semple, who led Taliban outreach for the EU mission in Afghanistan and is now at Harvard's Carr Center, and with Richard Barrett, who heads up the Taliban al-Qaeda monitoring unit for the United Nations Security Council. Are the recent reports of negotiations just information warfare, as Michael suggested recently in The Economist? What are the opportunities and pitfalls in this course of action? And finally, we will ask political counselor Ashraf Haidari, who's here with the Afghan embassy, to provide some reactions to the speakers, and then we will open up for questions. So with that, I will invite Claire to come up and frame the conversation for us.
Thank you. I'd like to start by challenging an assumption often we hear we're 9 years in or we're 10 years into a war. And I think it's important to challenge that time frame, especially as we're looking very closely at time frames, some within months or maximum a year. To Afghans, I don't think this has been a 9-year war. I think it's probably been a 31-year conflict, or perhaps a decades-long series of wars. At the other extreme, and for many of us who lived and worked on the ground over the last decade, there was a 3-week war in October and November of 2001. Followed by, ultimately, an imperfect and perhaps failed and under-resourced peace and reconciliation process, peace and reconstruction process, and then a relapse into conflict. And it's really only since 2008 or 2009 that the Afghan situation has been framed as a war. Now, looking forward, where are we now? And it's clearly at another open moment or a crossroads for Afghanistan, and perhaps one where the military approach now has been defined and articulated with a measure of clarity. And there's clearly some debate about whether aspects of that strategy are right and can be adjusted, and it contains a balance or measures, some of which are counterinsurgency counteroffensive, some of which are counterinsurgency, and some of which are based on security assistance. I think what's yet to be articulated with a similar clarity is the approach to the political dimension, the diplomatic dimension, and the economic dimension. And I'll talk now about 4 elements, all of which I think there's an opportunity now for a more robust definition and perhaps implementation. Sometimes the two are framed as military and civilian, and I think if the sum total at the moment of this, the civilian effort, is often framed as a civilian surge consisting of civilian officials travelling from the US to Afghanistan, that's clearly not sufficient. But yet there are opportunities, there are processes underway, some of which are framed in terms of transition, and certainly as the US works towards forming a strategic framework or strategic partnership with Afghanistan over the next few months, a clear opportunity for this. The first of these is clearly the articulation and facilitation of a regional framework. And many have spoken today of this, so I won't rehearse those arguments, but just to reiterate and agree with the centrality of this. A future diplomatic agreement, I think, would have to include, or should surely include, some kind of regional pact where Afghanistan commits to a form of neutrality or non-alignment within the region, and its neighbours commit to non-interference and support for stability, peace and stability within Afghanistan, and that there's the opportunity for this type of arrangement to include not only political and security aspects, but to build on the positive opportunities for win-win economic interests to be reinforced. And essentially what we're talking about is potentially the resurgence of a continental Asian economy that provides mutual interests, economic interests, similar to the opportunity after World War II that Europe took the opportunity of. It was coal and steel that formed the basis for the European Union that made war within Europe unthinkable again. So what's the coal and steel of the South Asian region? And I've very much heartened to see so much discussion of that today. The keynote speaker referencing the SARC, the New Silk Route Initiative, and so on. But a lot of this, I think, remains aspirational, and a lot more work needs to be done. And particularly because much of the diplomacy over the last months and years, I think, has reverted, perhaps because of the central engagement of NATO as the security dimension came to the fore, has privileged or put to the fore the US, Canadian and European players, and has somewhat marginalised or downplayed the stakeholder interests of the regional powers. The NATO, the US-Europe diplomatic construct made sense for Bosnia, because Bosnia is in Europe. It doesn't make sense for Afghanistan. And while the Bonn I process, the 2001 to 2005 period, was imperfect, I think one of the things that Lakhdar Brahimi very much got right was starting with the region. Moving on now to the second dimension. A political process. There's some talk of the need for a political settlement, singular. I would challenge that construct. There may eventually be one political settlement. People sitting around a table in a room signing one piece of paper. I think more realistic is to think of political settlements in the plural, or a political process or processes. And this has several dimensions. And I think the foremost is to think about what type of politics, what type of political order will provide an enduring stability within Afghanistan and its region, so Afghans can manage their own internal conflicts in future years. Because of the events of the last, and particularly the way the Bonn Agreement was framed, it may be that external actors have saddled a constitutional and democratic order on Afghanistan that at this moment remains a shell. So the formal order is now a democracy and a constitutional order, but there remains much work to be done on the ground in practice to make that a reality. And I wonder whether in the rejection of the last administration's democratization agenda, we haven't thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And certainly a lot more thinking needs to be done about the political landscape. is now the time in Afghanistan for political parties or not? What to do about the jihadi political parties that are a legacy from the 1980s Cold War struggle? Do these provide a possible basis for future political parties or not? Is the country ripe for some form of social movement or not? And under what conditions would that emerge? It was quite galling and disappointing for observers of the political scene to observe the 2009 election, not because necessarily of the outcome, but because of the absolute neglect of the type of assistance that went into the 2004 and 5 elections, the kind of voter registration, engagement with political parties and so on. Again, looking at the Constitution, often people say the Constitution needs to be amended because of factor X, Y, or Z. If you read the Constitution, X, Y, or Z probably isn't in the Constitution. And the Constitution itself mandates a series of laws to be written and passed. They haven't been written yet. So again, it's about implementing the Constitution that exists. For example, the Constitution mandates municipal elections. Municipal elections haven't happened yet. So first question is, what is the internal political process? What type of political order will prevail? Second, if there is to be a peace process or a process leading to conflict termination, which is how this war surely should and will end, what's to be the shape of that process? An acute Afghan observer of the social scene, an Afghan civil society leader, observed that in any society there are 1% thugs, 4% extremists, and 95% ordinary people. And he said the problem comes in Afghanistan when you empower the thugs with money and guns and you put them in power. They oppress the people, the 95%, who have no voice and no option but to ally themselves with the 4% extremists. He said this is the cycle that Afghanistan has been through. And I wonder whether the 95% aren't the natural allies of law and order in the country. And what are external actors doing to understand that 95% and support the 95%? And we'll hear from others on the panel about the possible shape of talks in a peace process. But I think, and as the new Special Representative of the Secretary General, Stefan de Mistura, very rightly says, whenever the question of talks comes up, and in launching the Salam support group, the peace support group, the UN now will be playing a role in supporting those deliberations. But he also says, what do the Afghans want? What's the framework for a future Afghanistan that all stakeholders can buy into, that can provide that basis for stability? And while US interests have been clearly articulated in terms of the struggle against al-Qaeda, I think one also has the question, does not the US also have interests in resolving the series of conflicts that have prevailed in Afghanistan in a way that will be sustainable rather than will relapse back into a conflict or a civil war? And if the US doesn't want to take the lead role in that conflict resolution approach, then which other actors? Is it the UN? And I think possibly the UN is the organization best placed to play that role. Or what other organizations, the OIC, other Track 2 initiatives that can support those initiatives to resolve some of those deeper conflicts. And then finally, in terms of the political process, while 18 months is a long time in Washington, 18 months is a very short time in Afghanistan. And I think one of the things to think about is that the Constitution itself mandates that no president shall serve for more than 2 terms. So in 3.5 years, there will be, if the Constitution is to be followed, a transfer of power. So I think it's worth thinking through what is the nature of that succession in 3.5 years' time, especially since that it's much of the political behaviour, the behaviour of the political elite, is driven by preparing itself for that succession. And then what type of investment in the democratization agenda might actually help to mitigate some of the crises that go on today. So what type of succession are we looking forwards to? And to ask the question, how is it that some communities have been able to mobilize the middle against the extremes? So for example, the Hazara community, we saw school teachers and social activists mobilize against the Shia rape law and take to the streets to defend. Why has that similar mobilization not taken place within the Pashtun community to challenge some of the more extremist groups? Moving then on to two other dimensions, the question of the future of the Afghan state. I think it's very, very clear, and I certainly wouldn't be one to advocate that external militaries and billions of dollars of assistance is there to create a Switzerland or a Valhalla out of Afghanistan. But any country in the world needs, our current global order is built on a system of sovereign states. So what does, if Afghanistan is to be sustainable, if it's not to be a permanent form of occupation or trusteeship, what would a sustainable Afghan state look like? One that can manage itself, take care of its internal security, not be a threat to its neighbours. Often those travelling outside to a society will say it's a tabula rasa, there's nothing there, it's a blank slate. And I think that's a mistake in the case of Afghanistan. In 2001, a group of us were astonished to find there was a functioning civil service, 240,000 civil servants. Actually, a lot of damage has been done to state institutions since then because we've leached away their capability. Essentially, we hired the doctors, teachers, and engineers to become drivers' assistants and translators for our own organisations. But we are now where we are. What needs to be done now? I think essentially three things. One, to agree on a map of governance. Afghanistan has 5 levels: the centre, province, district, village, and municipality. And all too often we go in fads and fashions. One minute it's the village, the next it's the district. I think now it's about to be the municipality. But we've got to see the system as a system. And when I travel around Afghanistan, I ask, could somebody show me an org chart of the Afghan government? I haven't yet been able to see one. So agreement on the rules of the game is imperative. And second, understanding that a civil service or the state is about people. And I think one of the greatest disservice that the international community over the last decade has done to Afghanistan is to prevent the education of its people. Back in 2001, the UN and the World Bank told the Afghan government, you're not allowed to invest in education of any Afghan over the age of 11. Why? Because of the Millennium Development Goals of the UN. So the Afghan officials had to erase from the budget all support to secondary education, vocational training, and tertiary education. And then several years later, we complain Afghans have no capacity. And we spend billions of dollars a year on bringing in technical assistance from all around the world. Last year, the amount spent in the Afghan national budget for secondary higher education was $35 million. So I think this is one of the most serious policy failures that need to be addressed. And this doesn't mean that this budget needs to come out of USAID or others. It's about much of it could be financed internally from the minerals revenue or others. But it's a policy failure that needs to be addressed. And then finally, a question of organizational culture. We see when we look at the resolution of civil wars around the world that where you have a revolutionary movement or a resistance movement, there's a class of people who made enormous sacrifices to fight a war. And here I'm referring to the generation of Afghans who led and fought the resistance against the Soviet Union in the 80s, and then beyond in the struggle in the Civil War. And I think there was a sense in 2001 that those who had fought deserved the spoils of war, they deserved to rule. But as we see from the SPLM in South Sudan and the Maoists in Nepal and other places, it's very difficult often for a resistance movement or a revolution movement to adapt to accountable use of power and governing. So how is this class of people and leaders to adapt themselves to become accountable to the rule of law? And I think this partly lies at the heart of the corruption problem. And then finally, the fourth part of, I think what needs to be done and articulated is a focus on the economy. And I'm delighted that Mr. Kian's going to be speaking at greater length on this topic, so I won't cover it in detail, except to say that I think often we fall into the trap of equating development with foreign aid, and we equate foreign aid with USAID. And a development process, particularly economic development, is a much broader construct. And one clear component is the integration of Afghanistan and its neighbours into an economic trade and transportation construct. But another is not about spending a lot of foreign money through contractors, UN agencies, NGOs. It's about making the Afghan revenue system work so that Afghans can pay for themselves. And there are enormous riches, not only from customs and trade, but the minerals potential. And yes, it might take 10 years to get it out of the ground, but the financing arrangements could provide for interim revenue flows. And why else is the economy important? Of course, is it provides jobs and skills, particularly for young men. And working on that agenda, an agenda of jobs and skills, which we know is important to any country, is surely going to be essential for stability. Dr. Ghani and I often say that if we rewrote our book today, it wouldn't be so much about the state. It would be about the balance between the state, the market, and civil society. And I think those two dimensions of the market and civil society are ones that have been forgotten, particularly when the state-building route hits something of constraints and a roadblock. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, Claire, that was an excellent summary of what I'm about to talk about. Thank you for helping me with that. I appreciate it. I want to thank Steve Cole and New America Foundation for organizing this important conference and inviting me here. I'd like to share a little bit of personal experience very quickly. I accepted an invitation by the Pentagon to go to Afghanistan in March 2010, just a few months ago. So when Paul Brinkley called and said, let's go to Afghanistan, I went there. I went to Kabul, went to Herat, and I saw hardworking people, got up in the morning, went to work. I saw a country that was moving. I talked to Afghans in government, private sector, and I came back with the limited vision of a visitor who spent a few days in Afghanistan. I had an advantage. I could speak the language. I could talk to people, and I saw a bit less complexity in having conversations with people in terms of what they were comfortable in sharing with me or not. It took a little bit of an edge out, and I came back with my own independent perspective of what the Afghans felt about their country. So quickly after my return, I had a conversation with Captain Wayne Porter. Captain Wayne Porter talked to me about the idea of a civilian conservation corps. I'd read the background, and I knew that it's probably a stretch to compare the days of FDR and his civilian conservation corps to 2010 and Afghanistan. But I also saw a lot of parallels, many, and I began to take a deep interest in the subject. And it didn't take me too long before I completely subscribed to the idea. And I'll talk about that in a little while. Shortly after that, put our heads together in finding ways to address three specific issues that Claire addressed as well. The three issues are the corruption issue, finding a way to fund economic development, and the idea of a sustainable model for Afghanistan. So I put all of this together, and I saw two narratives before me. One narrative said Afghanistan is a failed state. The risks are too high, security is too low, natural resources are underground, and there's a long way between what's in the ground and what's in the bank. So there's no value here. Let's shut all engines down and go home. And this narrative, although emotionally appealing, objectively was not acceptable to me. Technically, I could not subscribe to this narrative because as a banker, as a technician, I cannot call a going concern a bankrupt and failed entity. A balance sheet that has more assets in it than liabilities technically cannot be written off as failed and bankrupt. The other narrative before me was one that instead of placing all the focus on security issues and high risk and low security, recognized the interdependence of security and prosperity and sustainability of one depending on the other, and it focuses on defining a path forward that aims at spreading energies and resources with a dual focus of economic development and security. In such a narrative, I saw that jobs are the best weapon against corruption. Let me just share a quick story with you. Young Afghan gets recruited into the National Police Force. He's not earning enough money. He has no skills. His friend is talking to him. So, you have just become a servant. I guess the word is nokar, or very demeaning word. You've become a servant. So what do you have to show for that? Can you now marry your cousin, your friend, your fiancée, Layla, who's been waiting for you for 5 years? Can you afford a decent dowry? No. With that answer, a whole new world of opportunity is opened to the Taliban, LAT, others, whoever is interested, to put down the newly attained status of this young man and put him down and shame him into that status and recruit him into what they want because he's not earning enough money. So jobs are the best weapon against corruption. I see that hope is the best weapon against fear, and it's proven. I guess I could say honor mixed with that hope offers the promise of a better life for the Afghans, and this is the recipe that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So on the requirements for this prosperity, the way this narrative that I do subscribe to offers it, I see the need for forging a strategy that focuses on a sustainable path forward. And focusing on sustainability, again, objectively, I cannot see that a foreign-funded Afghan-assisted modality can qualify as a sustainable economic development mode. I see an Afghan-funded, foreign-assisted model instead to be sustainable. I would think that you all agree with me that in economic development you need intellectual capital, ideas, you need financial capital, money to fund it, and you need human capital, people to do it. So intellectual capital, thankfully, is not too difficult to obtain. There are a lot of good ideas that can be tested. Financial capital can be structured, but human capital is not so easy to develop. Unfortunately, human capital takes time to develop. You cannot take a person and train them to be a carpenter in no time, or a plumber, or a road builder, or a mine worker, and many other skills. It takes time to be able to train them. The path forward, that the ideas that we are thinking about, we have to be very careful about these ideas because even though I said that the intellectual capital is so easy to come by, we have to be very careful. A lot of time has been spent, a lot of ideas have been tried. We really have to be focused and extremely committed when we step forward and subscribe to a particular idea. We have to be so committed to it to make sure that there is delivery, because the believability is suffering at this time, and I recognize that. So I say that to not underestimate the enormity of the task forward. I don't mean to suggest that there are very easy solutions and so forth. It is not a walk in the park, but it can be done. So 3 things. Corruption. Again, this is an Afghan question. In that, in July of 2010, President Karzai announced, I believe, although I'm not familiar with the details of this, that the United Nations Convention Against Corruption has been adopted. Now, this needs an implementation plan. I believe Afghans do have a focus and a desire to put together a practical team that can implement the UN Convention Against Corruption, and this team could take the form of all the elements that I said earlier would form the foreign assistant portion of the model. You could take officials from all the stakeholders to be able to participate in that implementation body of the Convention Against Corruption. The second part, which would support the Civilian Conservation Corps would take the young Afghans of age 17 to 25, typically fighting age, put them in camp-like environment that would not only train them in the morning but offer education in the evening, create an environment that attracts to young men of that age. They like to get up in the morning and do things and learn things together and so forth. And I guess those of you who are experts in matters related to the terrorist camps would probably find similarities of how they attract these young men and what they use in giving them some satisfaction in joining them. So the same ways they would come to learn skills that would become durable for them in these camp-like settings. They would get educated, and everyone talks about the natural resources of Afghanistan. I think a very important part of the assets of the country are in its youth. They're capable people who can be trained to do things. They have a desire to build a better future. They are the best assets of the country. If you train them, they will train others, and this would become the best renewable, sustainable economic development. Plus, if you don't have trained labor, I hear that all kinds of projects are being talked about. Who's going to build them? Where's the labor going to come from? So this is not just an idea, it's a necessity. We have to think about the Afghan people. Not only the fact that giving a job to them and feeding their families at a standard that would take them away as a potential recruit, but also building a future for them. It is possible to do that. So the question is, you would say, how do you fund all of this? Well, there is a way to do that. There's a way to do that by getting away from all discussions of risk in terms of creating a reasonable assurance of repayment, from loans to be made to finance the future economic development of Afghanistan. The Export-Import Bank of the United States, although closed officially for regular programs in Afghanistan, has a provision in our operations. It's nothing new. This is an old project finance modality. We externalize the risk. So what happens is natural resources revenues are at the direction of an entity that oversees safe and sound execution of the projects, would be placed in an escrow account in a third country, and the escrow accounts would have instructions to repay the credits that are extended for any purpose. This takes the risk out altogether. It leaves some risk of operation of the sources of revenue, and that can be managed as well. So this is the technicalities of what we do. We don't eliminate risk, we mitigate risk and bring it down to a practicality where we can still provide the tools necessary for economic development. We had a paper that's written, a white paper that's written with the intention of just putting in bits and pieces of this idea made available to you, and I hope you all have had the opportunity to take one. But before I wrap it up here on this talk, I'd like to say that this is not an Afghan problem, and it's not something that requires a single solution in this way by one entity or another. This is an issue that it's a global issue. It's a regional issue, and also it's a global issue. And in my travels, I talk to people from various countries. I know that immediately Pakistan, India, China, others are there, an important role in economic development, the regional perspective. But I talk to people in other countries. I've talked to people in Turkey who are very interested in economic development in Afghanistan. I've talked to Kazakhs who are very interested in economic development, and I believe they have even allocated certain resources, particularly earmarked for education. So again, three things: corruption, with the modality of the adoption of UN Convention Against Corruption, an implementation team, funding through externalizing the risk, and a real idea of sustainable economic development by putting the young Afghans to work in a way that would guarantee a better future for them. Thank you very much.
Well, I guess one day, thank you first to the New America Foundation for inviting me and arranging this, and I presume that in due course there'll be conferences that deal with key issues that don't relate to Afghanistan. I mean, it's been 30 years, 31 years in fact, as Claire said, since Afghanistan has been in conflict of one sort or another, but no doubt one day that'll all come to an end. But it's clear that there are very many obstacles in the way of that, both inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan. And some of the difficulties, of course, of perception, some of the difficulties are of fact, and some of misunderstandings and some of lack of understandings. But I just mention one or two that I think are rather important, that get in the way of discussion with the various fighting parties if we're to try and move towards a settlement. And I think one of the main ones is that no side in this conflict is really clear what victory would look like. That's sort of been lost. People know what their basic demands are, but they don't know what the end state would be that they would really welcome. And when there's a confusion in your objectives, obviously there's a great deal of confusion in the road to reach them. The insurgent demands, of course, are essentially three at the moment. And I say at the moment because they have changed and they may change again. And that is the withdrawal of foreign forces, the release of prisoners, of Taliban prisoners, and the removal of Taliban names from the 1267 list. That's the UN sanctions list. Well, of those, of course, as I'll come on to later, there's maybe some nuance, some sort of interpretation one can put on them, some sort of change that one could detect in the way that those basic demands are presented at the moment. But certainly they don't add up to a policy for the future of Afghanistan. They're just, how do we get to the table to start talking about the future of Afghanistan? And of course, once you've dealt with the withdrawal of foreign forces, the release of prisoners, and the removal of names from the 1267 UN sanctions list, you're already well down the road towards the future of Afghanistan. So it's difficult to deal with an insurgent group which doesn't actually put forward any real policy. And clearly also within the insurgent movement there is a division of opinion that some people will favour talks, some people won't, some people will favour doing things according to other outside masters, and some people will not, and so on. And that disaggregation almost of the insurgency presents its own problems when it comes to talking to the insurgency, because you need obviously to talk to a group if you're to come to an overall settlement. Or else you have to be satisfied with lots of little settlements which may be upset by something happening elsewhere in the country. And another problem which really militates against a settlement is the policy that both sides follow at the moment of decapitation. The Taliban have been very successful in that, of course, in removing people in local communities who may oppose them, people with education, people who may provide a different vision, and even, of course, doctors and nurses and school teachers, as well as community leaders, and they'd be commonly blowing up schools and stuff like that. Well, that's not a very good basis for building a country. And, of course, this drives many of the educated classes away, most of them abroad, but many of them perhaps just to safer areas or elsewhere in the region. And it brings down the age of the regional local commanders. The NDS, the Afghan Security Organization, I remember told me in June that the average age of local commanders had dropped from about 35 to 25. And that is considerable when you think about the levels of maturity and experience, because those 25-year-olds, of course, will have known nothing but conflict since they were born. And then beyond that, there's the problem of corruption, which has been mentioned already. And corruption, of course, now difficult to extirpate, really, from Afghanistan, and indeed from many other countries which aren't facing internal conflict. But the issues of corruption in Afghanistan are slightly different in that one of the solutions for Afghanistan continues to be the pouring in of countless millions of dollars. And in my view, the Afghan economy from the very start has been totally inadequate to deal with this huge influx of money, which has led in many ways to the levels of corruption we see today, where people, having no confidence in the future, take what they can while they can. And indeed, that lack of confidence in the future, of course, has affected governance as well. There's a sore lack of governance, particularly in the rural areas in Afghanistan, a lack of capacity, but also a lack of interest. And that leads, as I think Director Khan was saying, to a lack of hope. But having said all that on the negative side, I think we can also say that there's some things on the positive side when we look towards some sort of negotiation for a settlement, for some sort of peace. And they're not because necessarily everybody wants to achieve that as quickly as possible, but it is because at the moment there are certain time pressures, I think, which are playing on many of the parties. One thing that is noticeable and I think remarkable about Afghanistan is that Afghanistan still remains Afghanistan, that whether you're a Tajik or a Hazara or Uzbek or Pashtun or whatever, within Afghanistan you still regard yourself as an Afghan. That is enormously important, of course, for the future. It could be eroded, there's no doubt. I mean, although the representation at government level is pretty good, pretty even according to the population spread, in the army it is not, in the police force it is not. And when you're creating an army which is essentially being created to keep internal control rather than to combat external enemies, well, first of all, it's not a very good model, and second, you do need it to be representative. But Afghanistan is Afghanistan still, and I think that it is, as previous speakers have said, less currently an extension of the Indo-Pakistan rivalries. That is, I think, for several reasons. First of all, Pakistan faces intense problems at the moment. We heard the Inspector General say earlier about the difficulties in the tribal areas. And Tehrik-e-Taliban is becoming stronger, although it was dismissed as just a group of tribals who had no capacity at all. I remember by ISI people even as recently as 2 years ago. Now when you look at the Najib al-Azazi plot or the Faisal Shahzad plot, or generally what's going on in the tribal areas, they clearly are a threat not just to people here occasionally, but more persistently to Pakistan and the Pakistan state. And the Pakistan state may wonder how that's going to play out. Okay, they may feel they still have some control over the Haqqani network, but could they actually exercise that control? Would Haqqani actually do what he was told to do? And would he help to deal with the Tehrik-e-Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban? Will Hafizul Bahadur, for example, stay allied to the Pakistani government and their other allies in that area, or will their interests shift as they see the army actually not unwilling to go into North Waziristan, but unable to go into North Waziristan with any certainty of victory? And I don't know whether General Kayani has said it to any of you, but I remember him saying it to me, and I thought it was significant. He said, well, people go on pushing us to go into Waziristan. Well, what if we lose? It may have been rhetorical, but nonetheless, it was an interesting question. And then in India, too, as time goes on, the threat from Lashkar-e-Taiba and other groups like that grows. Both the Punjabi groups also a real factor now for Pakistan, because Punjabi groups are growing in strength, despite their having been hammered for a long time by the Pakistan military and by Pakistan police. Nonetheless, even groups like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi are still alive, Jaish Mohammed is still alive, and of course the LET is hardly affected at all. And while Pakistan has a difficulty with dealing with those Punjabi groups and so sees the problems in the tribal areas spreading down into the heartland of the country, so you get attacks in Lahore and of course attacks increasingly in Sindh, the problems no longer look so containable, both for Pakistan and for India, because Lashkar-e-Taiba did a fantastic job from their point of view with Mumbai, and again, as was said earlier, will have learnt from that they can bring the levels of tension between the two countries to almost boiling point quite easily, and India will want Pakistan to be able to control Lashkar-e-Taiba. So I would argue it's also in India's interest to see some settlement in Afghanistan which takes pressure off Pakistan and helps Pakistan deal with its own internal problems. And beyond India, Pakistan, I think the other regional players also increasingly, as time goes by, see an interest in peace. Russia, which has, I think, up till now been very happy to see America fight its war at zero cost pretty much to Russia, and now I think starts worrying about, well, what will happen next? This is not really going the way that everybody hoped it would. We already have a huge drugs problem in Russia, which is growing. That's all coming from Afghanistan. That's not being dealt with particularly, though it was interesting, of course, the raid that the Russian forces joined the other day to knock over some heroin labs. But nonetheless, the trend is more rather than less. And, of course, they worry enormously about the spread of fundamentalism into Central Asia. And for the moment, while the Taliban influences are growing in northern Afghanistan, whatever America and its allies may be doing are not really sorting that problem out for Russia. And similarly with Iran, which again has a huge drugs problem, also coming from Afghanistan. They may want to see the Americans nicely bogged down in Afghanistan, and they can tweak their tail occasionally and sort of adjusting the rear start of engagement with Taliban according to how well the Americans are doing. Nonetheless, in the long run, they must surely want peace, and as time goes on, they must want that more, because Jundullah is a problem on their border, and Jundullah links with Al-Qaeda and Taliban may be growing, and the Hazara, which should be their main interest within Afghanistan, relatively peaceful at the moment, but in a long-term solution they will need something that looks like peace and stability in Afghanistan rather than the current stalemate. And China, of course, a lot has been said about the Ainak mine. I know the Chinese ambassador saying to me in Kabul that, yeah, fine, the Chinese invested in the mine, and that was a long-term investment, started a long time ago, or at least conceived a long time ago, and they were confident with it up until last year, and they controlled the security around and felt that they could get on with their extraction, and now they're less confident because they need such a long time to make their money back and to get out what they want. And so I think that the Chinese too will be interested in seeing a settlement sooner rather than later. And of course the United States and her allies in ISAF also see enormous domestic pressures to conclude this war. So there are lots of reasons now that are increase as time goes on why everybody may be ready to try and compromise, try and come to an agreement which isn't absolutely what they wanted at the beginning, but nonetheless is satisfactory. And I know, and you may know of more, but I know of 12 initiatives now which are devoted to trying to bring Taliban and Afghan officials together to talk. That may be 12 too many, it's certainly 11 too many probably. It may be the case that none of those actually work, but the fact that there are now 12 initiatives, whereas a year ago I don't think there were, well, there was a couple, but there weren't very many, I think is evidence also that people are beginning to fear that just along the road there may be an abyss, and they need to avoid that. And of course the common objectives of all the parties involved in these initiatives are pretty similar, that everybody wants an independent, stable Afghanistan which has some view of prosperity. And indeed everybody involved in this wants the foreign forces to withdraw, not just the Taliban and not just President Karzai, but of course all the people who are fighting and all the neighbours as well. Ultimately, that is the end state. It's just a question of when and how. And in the Taliban side, I think there is a growing political maturity. I talked about their three demands: withdrawal of foreign troops, the release of prisoners, and the removal of their names from the UN sanctions list. Well, I think that Taliban, from what one can hear a little bit from them, understand that if foreign troops were to withdraw immediately, there would be a return to the sort of civil strife that we saw in Afghanistan before, and that is, I don't think, in their interests, not as nationals, not as Taliban. So I think that they understand that there may have to be some sort of guarantees and guarantors as the talks move forward, even if it means that foreign forces stay, so long as foreign forces remain in their bases and don't conduct aggressive operations. And these Taliban leaders who were ruling between 1996 and 2001 are now 9 or 10 years or whatever older. And I think that they have a maturity now that they may not have had when they were in their 20s trying to govern a country with absolutely no experience whatsoever. And they may have learned, I hope they may have learned from their mistakes. It seems in some ways that they have. The Taliban also, I think the Taliban leadership in what we call loosely the Quetta Shura will also be concerned that the reduction in age of regional and local commanders has made their control of the movement much harder. I mean, the Taliban have operated, like much of Afghanistan, with many interweaving and overlapping relationships between individuals without necessarily a hierarchy. But nonetheless, the Taliban will need to be able to say, if they come to a peace table, we can deliver certain things. And one of those things, of course, will be an end to the fighting. And if they say, well, we can deliver an end to the fighting, and they can't, well, what value have they at the negotiating table? They have none at all. So their future will be very grim. So if they have a political ambition, they need to ensure that they're in charge of the movement. And it's all very well to claim that you're in charge of the movement when everybody wants to move in the direction you're telling them to go. But when you start telling them to change direction, maybe they still want to go forward in the way that they have over the last years. And, of course, individual fiefdoms have been built up throughout southern and eastern Afghanistan, and increasingly now in the north as well, if you think of places like Balkh. So I think that the Taliban are in a bit of a bind. I think that they realize that the more time that goes on, the less control they'll have, so they're better to do something sooner rather than later. And indeed, just in an aside on that, mention of civilian casualties earlier, it is interesting that after the UN report on civilian casualties came out, the Taliban said, we will invite you to join a commission which would involve the Afghan government, the ISAF, the United Nations and the OIC, to go to these areas where you say the Taliban have been responsible for civilian casualties and the allied ISAF forces have not. And you can see for yourselves, excellent initiative, that we should grab any initiative like that to put the Taliban to the test and start talking to them and see who their spokespeople are and their negotiators are. So the fact that they offered that in itself, I think, is a good sign. And that is also a sign, I think, that the Taliban are beginning to be interested in governing rather than just dominating or ruling. So we have a situation now which I think is more propitious. We haven't really talked about the Al-Qaeda-Taliban nexus, but that also, I think, is something that as time goes on, the Taliban will reckon that Al-Qaeda is just a pain in the neck rather than any sort of advantage to them. So what we need really is a framework and a mechanism to allow the Taliban and the Afghan government to be able to talk together. Maybe one of these 12 initiatives will work, but maybe we need something else. Maybe also for the sake of engaging the United States and its allies, which is very important, but at the moment is not happening. We need the Taliban to be able to create some sort of political arm, like so many terrorist groups have, so that there's some interlocutors on the other side. But anyway, the balance has to shift from military to political, and to create the space for some regrowth of some practical, national, typically Afghan mechanisms, which will come forward probably of their own accord and recreate a possibility of peace for the Afghan people. Thank you.
All right, how long do I have?
15.
Can I lock the doors in case I need to go over? Go over. Hello, everyone. It's 1 month is November, and and 1 year on, and we're talking reconciliation again. So not just following a dear esteemed colleague on the same topic, but also in a sense carrying on with a topic that revisiting a topic that's sort of familiar. So I'll try and look at some of the things which are new in reconciliation, and I guess I want us to take at least 3 little things away from it at the end, and so I'll give those takeaways at the start in case I sort of get carried off in various directions along the way. I think that peace is possible in Afghanistan. It's worth pursuing, and it's damn good for both the Afghan people and the people of the United States. I hope that all the evidence I've looked at supports that. I also think I remain somewhat sceptical about the idea of the grand bargain, that they actually will, and this and Claire was I always agree with Claire. I like that one, that maybe we will not live to see the day where there is something like the peace conference where they actually sign the document and they wave it and everybody cheers and that's peace. Maybe we won't see a grand bargain, but the pursuit of something like a grand bargain may still contribute positively to achieving peace. And the third takeaway is that in the choice between fight and then talk, or talk and fight, my reading of the situation is that given that there isn't really an option of just talk, that talk and fight far outperforms talk then fight in moving towards a peaceful Afghanistan. I just do not buy this idea that we can pick how many months we have to fight for and then schedule the talking to begin the day after. So those are the 3 takeaways, and then I got to 10 points. Although I tend to be an optimist, and you saw from the takeaways, I start with the sort of pessimistic view, which is to remind us of what the default option is. Because there's no guarantee that we see a peaceful Afghanistan. There's no guarantee that there is even any meaningful political process. The default option, as we look forward to Afghanistan in 2014, look forward to Afghanistan in 2020, is of course that most of the good things that we've talked about today remain unfulfilled. That the Afghanistan in 2014 and 2020 looks rather more like the Afghanistan we see today than different from it, and so the parameters of change are measured in terms of first of all, maintaining the US troop levels while we're fighting, and then dropping them while we're transitioning, perhaps declines in some insurgent activity during the period when US troops are fanned out around the country, perhaps even some of the provinces going quiet, and then the gradual pickup and the insurgency picks up a new sustainable plateau as we move towards Afghanistan 2020, and then this miserable vision of the default option is that we found a cheaper way of sustaining a friendly Afghan government in Kabul which can avoid collapsing. But the fact that there is a continuing insurgency inside Afghanistan against the puppet regime is a continuing source of instability in Pakistan, keeps the insurgency going there, and ensures that the legitimate expectations of the peoples in those countries are dashed. That's the default option. We can achieve certain security objectives, but the peoples of those countries will not live their dreams. But moving on, I said, what's different, what's new. There's a whole series of things have changed, although we're still talking about reconciliation. It's gone up the agenda. There's been more, more thinking about the idea of reintegration as something which can be done along the way, bringing in low-level Taliban again, and separating it from the idea of more of a political settlement. I mean, I think it is significant that the Afghan government has now adopted reconciliation as policy, has invested a huge amount of political capital in it, and we get into the situation where now, when I stand up and talk about it is good to pursue both reintegration and reconciliation, when people try to criticise me as that this is somehow this is selling out in various things, I can say that I'm only towing the Afghan government line, as I always do. And of course, the big elephant in the room is that there is now a more serious military campaign, and of course we are bombarded with a series of stories about reconciliation as it's happening. So, to go through what are the implications of these? I mean, like many people, I try to work out what actually is the impact of the surge on the Taliban. I don't do this with the benefit of all the PowerPoints that some people are bombarded with, but I do listen to what some of the Taliban or people close to them are saying. They've spotted that the surge is real now. It is biting in a way that it wasn't biting at the start of the year. Of course, they themselves now acknowledge the high toll on the mid-level commanders, which they were able to deny earlier on in the year. And of course, even in some of the provinces, the insurgency actually has been decapitated. The main response that I see going on to this is basically there is a tendency for the next level of leadership in the provinces to basically head for the safe haven. But that is an attempt to ride out the surge rather than attempt to end the fight. It has also reinforced a tendency for the leadership basically to sit back in the safe haven and hope that they can task the commander networks in the provinces to keep on fighting. There is more of a gulf in between the older leadership sitting in Pakistan and the younger fighters sitting inside Afghanistan. I see no real evidence of anybody, exploiting or utilising that for going forward on the reintegration process, but it is something which is happening. And in some cases, of course, even the Taliban acknowledge that that there is a real expansion of the zone of government influence outside the towns, like a little bit more mobility for government officials in some of the provinces. It leaves, the hardliners thinking in terms of ride out. We have to adopt our tactics so that we can live to fight in a slightly different way tomorrow. The pragmatists, people who, unfortunately in the Taliban, who've broadly been in favour of some kind of deals, are left. They're left feeling bruised and saying, perhaps this push towards an unnecessary expansion in their view is actually provides a round of evidence that the US is fully committed to militarism. That is actually not interested in any kind of political settlement of the situation. And this is something which has been I've had articulated to me an awful lot in discussions with some of the Taliban. Because one of the things which is new compared to last year is that we are bombarded with these stories about ongoing negotiations. These stories, I want to obviously to try and unpick that a bit. What we are told broadly, if you read the press, we are told that it is happening. We're told that the Taliban leaders are now in talks with the Afghan government leaders. We're told that NATO is facilitating it. We're told that that Pakistan sometimes we're told is facilitating it. Helicopters taking off from Peshawar presumably is Pakistan facilitation. And of course we're told bits that that it reaches back into the detention system, that prisoners are talking. My own assessment, from trying to follow this as close as possible, is that tactical level contacts in the insurgency, they're normal, they're ongoing. They've been there from the start. It's the way business is conducted inside Afghanistan. That the stories which have been put out so far grossly exaggerate the significance of the contacts which are going on. They're largely tactically oriented rather than a part of a strategic process. I personally think that, well, I've seen that they are encouraging a degree of paranoia. Those people who are trying to sustain a sort of a united insurgency, keep the fight up to point X, sort of doing the Taliban version of fight then we'll see. Yes, they are more paranoid. Even some of their backers also get more paranoid. Whereas I'm well aware that some people will put that will consider that paranoia to be a great success, a great achievement. As someone who has tried to be involved in various different levels of dialogue over the years, I find it actually makes the dialogue rather more difficult. And a lot of people who do actually, on the Taliban side, who have a vision that someday we will be part of a political settlement, they've been given a hell of a lot of warning signs. They've basically been told that the second you start to do anything slightly serious, you'll be reading it on the front pages of the New York Times. That actually that worries them an awful lot. Say, how can we do business in this kind of atmosphere? If I had a little sort of little wish I could put in for Christmas or something, I would say that we could sort of like ring fence the idea of political contacts should somebody be off bounds for information warfare. I mean, do information warfare on other subjects. Leave the domain of political contacts as something that we can actually do for real later. Then Richard did rightly point to the idea of the Al-Qaeda, Taliban, South Asian jihadis, miscellaneous foreign militants nexus as something which is a significant context, part of the context for any possible settlement. I think it's actually crucial, and I sort of feel a little bit as somebody who I don't read all the intelligence summaries. I get the feedback from trying to to talk to people who are reasonably close to the ground, and what I see in that I see significant developments in this nexus at a time when every now and then you read the things about saying that we can reduce the significance of the international jihadi involvement in Afghanistan down to 104, 3, 200 Al-Qaeda's, tick them off, Al-Qaeda activists tick them off as they get picked off. I mean, what actually I see now is a proliferation of the nationalities and the groups who are associated with the insurgency, significant numbers still there engaged, which are not in any way communicated by the number of core Al-Qaeda activists. That there's probably been more integration of them into the conflict inside Afghanistan over the past year of conflict than previously. A lot of it is in the sense that is inward looking. It is towards the conflict in Afghanistan rather than Afghanistan as a springboard for operations overseas. But there is not a neat separation between those. But there's also a sort of a geographic and a network separation. Of course, this is very much the Waziristan story and those parts of the conflict which are serviced from Waziristan, and the dynamics of the relationship between the Kandaharis and the Kandahari insurgents with the foreign backers very different from the dynamics of the Waziristan insurgency. That's what one sees in terms of the interesting aspect for reconciliation and possible deals. That when you talk to the Taliban veterans, the old Kandaharis and so on, they're critically aware of this. That they in no way do they sort of see any kind of permanent alliance with Al-Qaeda or the foreign militants, and they are fully aware that a key part of any future deal would be the split from the foreign militants. And even to some extent, I mean, the Afghans who are involved in Waziristan have absolutely avoided any fusion of their organizations. There's a lot more cooperation on the battlefield now than previously. The leadership, the networks are entirely distinct. I mean, every now and then you see these little sort of stories appear in Long War Journal about people who are double-hatted between being part of one of the foreign organizations and the Taliban. It doesn't happen. It's not there. There is no fusion. They are potentially separate. So in a sense, that there is a key strategic opportunity there in terms of the future deal making. Just quickly, sort of whipping ahead towards the final bits of optimism. I mean, I think we've become over in the discourse over the past year, we've all been reminded multiple times about the different poles inside the insurgency, and everybody who wants to do Sir Talib studies has to stand up and explain the difference between Waziristan and Kandahar. In terms of the implications for future deal making, I think that we can say that a deal which tries to take one to make peace with one part of the insurgency while ignoring the others probably isn't going to work, but they all will fit into the deal slightly differently, so that any political process is going to have to be subtle and smart enough to cope with those different poles of influence. The generation issue has come up a few times in the discussion. I think it's absolutely critical, and it is one of the reasons why why you justify the idea that it's fight and talk, not just wait around, because still that the leadership which pioneered the movement in '94, which I was very pleased to hear Anand's description of their narrative that they have, which is essentially that you can summarize their narrative as saying the current war with the United States is unnecessary and was imposed upon us. We expected to be able to accommodate, and even now they have a vision of basically being incorporated into a system sharing with other Afghans. The reason for that is that that they had a formative stage inside the jihad against the Soviets. They had a sort of a crystallizing experience in governing most of Afghanistan and doing Afghan politics, finding strange ways of dealing with other Afghans, learning to accommodate with them, and they are still predominant in the leadership of the movement. Whereas, of course, I mean, these, the 25-year-olds and so on that you're talking about, people who've been mobilized since 2001, their whole adult experience has been fighting the United States and the puppet regime in Kabul. And in terms of, I can just say that the conversations which I have had, it seems much easier to find evidence of a possible meeting of minds between the different Afghans and the people that you meet in Kabul than when you're talking to those who were adults before 2001 and those who became adults after 2001. Talk now if you want to be able to avail of the social capital which that generation actually represents. Just a few quick messages back in terms of that I get coming back from the conversations with those Taliban. There still is this. I mean, consistently there is this message that key people inside the movement quietly say that they're in support of accommodation, that they understand that accommodation means working alongside other Afghans, not pursuing a monopoly of power in the country. They have also learnt the message that there will not be any complete military victory. And one of the key things that they keep on saying, quietly, is that they are highly constrained by the conditions of the insurgency and the requirements of waging the conflict in what they can either do politically and certainly what they can say. And this is why you get the reason that it's absolutely vital for them to have a period of quiet, confidential engagement, checking out what's possible before anything goes public, and why they're so horrified at the idea that stories will be on the New York Times even before this is started. And why they're basically indicating that you're going to have to do an awful lot of work if you're going to make this possible. And this is not a standard negotiating position. What the pragmatic Taliban are saying, and they do not control the whole movement, but they are a force. They're saying that we could play a positive role in achieving a peaceful Afghanistan, but you're going to have to help us. which is sort of taking on from what Anand said earlier on in terms of their narrative of how they got into the conflict. Because I mean, I'm going to be reminded on the time shortly. Just to say, in terms of it's important to think through the contours of the settlement. I think a little bit like the twin state solution for Palestine. Already now you can think through the contours of the settlement. When I talk to different actors, that there is a lot of overlap. Any sensible person realizes that a settlement is about it's about incorporating into a reformed system rather than overflowing the system, in which there will be significant change of narrative, so that different Afghans find ways of communicating about each other as allies and partners rather than as foes. There will, of course, have to be a broader agenda of achieving grievances which are not just of addressing grievances, which are not just grievances of the armed opposition, but are also grievances for many other parts of Afghan society. And just finally, because we were invited here really to talk about the regional issues and how it all fits into the regional perspective. Broadly, I think that there is more opportunity. Well, the continuation of conflict inside Afghanistan definitely exports instability to the rest of the region. It has become a la mode to be able to think in terms of the grand visions and the new regional great game and how we can have regional initiatives in support of peace in Afghanistan. We shouldn't get carried away in that. I think that most of the effort of making it possible for peace in Afghanistan will actually be devoted inside Afghanistan. Success or failure will be inside Afghanistan. That can be supported by and given given some help by some of the regional initiatives, like unpicking the Pakistan-India problem as it affects India. But we run a risk that excess focus, if we go too far the other direction, excess focus on the regional dimension could be setting up all these sort of these great the theatrical initiatives that everybody promises to do something and has got no real impact on the ground. The stuff which is going to deliver change on the ground, and which there are policy instruments which can be brought to bear if there is political will, largely do lie inside Afghanistan. So if it's a choice between Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg on one side or Stalin on the other, Stalin wins in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much. I'll be really short. My time is short here. So what I will do is basically put, I think, whatever has been discussed today, especially by this panel, and their proper contexts: internal, regional, transnational, and international. So with that, first of all, I would like to thank the New America Foundation for hosting today's seminar to highlight and help find durable solutions to our shared problems in Afghanistan. I also wish to thank and recognize the contributions of Steve Call, your colleague, and Peter Bergen, yourself, for your very constructive coverage of Afghanistan issues, as well as your monumental books, which I believe continue to inform us all. And I'm pleased to briefly talk to you about overall security. And I think I saw my name associated with security in the first agenda, and then also briefly comment on what has been said so far. Let me say that there are four interconnected factors that contribute to insecurity in Afghanistan. And let me explain each. The first has to do with problems internal to Afghanistan. The second has to do with regional interference and Afghan affairs. We can talk about the Taliban whatever we want, but at the end of the day, it's a regional problem. It was a problem that was created and launched by the Pakistani Army and intelligence back in '94, and it is maintained as we speak today. The third has to do with the transnational security threats that transcend borders. That's Al-Qaeda, of course. And the last has to do with the ways in which the international community has tried to assist Afghanistan. They're all interconnected. Each of these challenges, which I shall discuss, feeds off one another. And together they have created a vicious circle which destabilizes Afghanistan. If you do not connect one dot to the other, you do not get a full picture for why Afghanistan is insecure, for why Afghanistan is still unstable. We often talk about these problems as isolated problems, which are somehow Afghans' problems. And just we need to find solutions and find Afghan solutions, and unless we solve it in Afghanistan, it cannot be done outside Afghanistan. But the fact of the matter is that these are non-Afghan problems with, like I said, regional roots, international roots, and transnational roots. And the problems internal to Afghanistan were crippled by our landlocked geography, our least developed status even before the conflicts started, before the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. 30 years of war and destruction that followed, and now a culture of abject poverty. It's very important. That's why jobs are critical, and I agree with that. And profound human insecurity that pervade the Afghan society, even though we're a very resilient and enterprising nation. Also, our state institutions remain weak, and we lack the requisite resources to deliver basic services to a population of what I consider vulnerable groups. We are a nation of vulnerable groups. Always keep that in mind. That includes returning refugees, internally displaced people, the disabled, former combatants, jobless youth, the elderly, and women and children. They are all vulnerable groups. I think that in such environment of human desperation and insecurity, socioeconomic grievances are commonplace. There's nothing to do with being a Tajik or Hazara or Pashtun and so on and so forth, which can easily be, those grievances, be exploited by internal and external actors to destabilize Afghanistan. The regional dimension of instability that exploits our internal vulnerabilities, those vulnerable groups, is well documented and has deeper roots in the region, in Pakistan, in Iran, especially in the context of Pakistan's hostile relationship with India. Because at the end of the day, we are a victim of that relationship, that hostility. If India and Pakistan moves on, and the United States plays a constructive long-term role in helping the two countries overcome that, then Afghanistan will, of course, be stabilized. So it is in this hostile context that we must understand why Pakistan created, like I said, and supported the Taliban movement to control Afghanistan until 2001. Pakistan continues to pursue a dual policy of fighting the Pakistani Taliban, but actively sheltering, supplying, and supporting the Taliban that mainly operate in Afghanistan. And I think this was also most recently covered in Bob Woodward's book, where, of course, General Kehani said we are India-centric, just in 2 words, that they will not give up on sheltering, on supporting, on, of course, maintaining the whole Taliban infrastructure, especially in North Waziristan, the Afghani network, and the likes, unless, of course, their fears are addressed. At the same time, transnational actors such as Al-Qaeda have capitalized on Afghanistan's internal and regional sources of instability and formed strategic alliances with the Taliban. Their relationship is one of symbiotic, as the survival of one depends on the other. I also disagree with, some of the Taliban, as we say, just come to Afghanistan and join the process and they will go about their business and become part of the ruling and governing body in Afghanistan. That's why we have specific conditions on our part for reconciliation and reintegration, and as we also recently formed the High Council on Peace to implement those conditions. Al-Qaeda and their Pakistani affiliates continue to inspire, indoctrinate, and brainwash jobless and frustrated youth in the Pakistani madrasas, where the Taliban recruit fighters for their terrorist operations in Afghanistan. At the same time, transnational drug mafia. This is also a transnational problem that is in Afghanistan. In essence, we're fighting it as an Afghan problem, but yet with global demand. 95% outside Afghanistan. A $40 billion business, black market business, which we are effectively fighting with less than $1 billion. That's why we're failing. Of course, this transnational drug mafia has found a permissive environment in the south and east of Afghanistan where the Taliban financially benefit from taxation of poppy farmers and protection of trafficking of precursor chemicals into Afghanistan and finished narcotic products out of the country. Finally, the very international response to these challenges facing Afghanistan has been inadequate and uncoordinated. This has grown to become part of the largest security problem in Afghanistan. Many of us quickly forget that Afghanistan had no state institutions when the Taliban were overthrown in 2001. There was zero stateness in Afghanistan. Even before the former Soviet Union invaded and occupied Afghanistan, state institutions were extremely weak. They were, of course, limited to Kabul. The process of state building in Afghanistan had effectively started in 1920s under King Amanullah, and it stalled under, of course, King Nader Khan and Ihsan Zahir Shah. So, to begin with, they, of course, state in Afghanistan was weak, and then it was destroyed, at least, for a decade during 1990s. The Bonn Agreement essentially gave Afghans a government on the paper. But following that process, no well-resourced state-building strategy was adopted to provide Afghanistan with institutional capacity to deliver basic services to people. So, of course, we embraced the democratic state institutions. Remember, 83% of the registered voters in Afghanistan turned out to vote. As much as we were told, or labeled as a backward, traditional, tribal, the labels that I hate, illiterate, yet Afghans are one of the most, young populations in the region. Unfortunately, we die at the age of 42. 75% of Afghans are below the age of 25. That's more or less my generation, a generation that looks forward, not backward, not to the Afghanistan of 2 centuries ago, not the Afghanistan of when the Britons fought and lost in Afghanistan. This is a completely different Afghanistan. It's an Afghanistan that wants a partnership with NATO, seeks a future with democracy. That's why, in the last parliamentary elections, of course, fraud, and that can be debated, but still people turned out to vote. More women, in fact, campaigned this time than they did in 2005. That's because Afghans want this process to succeed. So, and also for 7 years, the priorities of state building in Afghanistan were shortchanged because of the diversion of attention and resources to Iraq. And you, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, once famously said, in Iraq we do what we must, in Afghanistan we do what we can. This statement sums up the U.S. and NATO engagement in Afghanistan for 7 years, which the Obama administration realized had led to the full resurgence of the Taliban and their expanding control of the south and east of Afghanistan, where the Afghan government has been either absent or too weak. We often talk about presence. We just assume the presence of the Afghan government. In essence, we've been absent. And where we've been present, our presence is worse than our absence, because our presence is unfortunately predatory because of a lack of resources, capacity, equipment to deliver those basic services, which include basic security and justice, law, and order. International intervention in Afghanistan has also lacked the Afghan leadership and ownership of the rebuilding process. Ownership as Afghans in the driver's seat of rebuilding process is mostly absent, since some 80% of the aid resources have bypassed the Afghan government and gone to parallel non-state institutions, NGOs, a family of United Nations, and the private sector. With resources diverted from our institutions, we can hardly retain competitive employees for effective service delivery and often lose them to higher paid jobs with international organizations. So it is obvious that weak institutional capacity and underpayment cause widespread corruption in the Afghan system. And I call this functional corruption, petty corruption. Because if you're not paid, if you're not equipped, the only incentive for you to be in the Afghan government is to accept bribes. When I got my own ID card, with all my legal, papers in my hands, I was asked to just shell out 500 Afghanis. And I said, why? He said, I have a family support, for God's sake. This is how much you get. I just talked to our Minister of Economy. I asked, how much is your civil servants are getting? He said, under 60, and sometimes they're not paid, the majority of them. What do you do with under $60? It's hard. So rife corruption, in turn, harms the legitimacy of the Afghan government in public eyes, which we know leaves a negative impact on both governance and security across Afghanistan. So I'll be brief on opportunities. These are our problems. They're interconnected. And I think we shouldn't, like I said in the beginning, look at them as isolated ones, but as, part and parcel of one another. First, I think the most important strategic opportunity for success in Afghanistan are the Afghan people, because they remain supportive of international presence in Afghanistan and seek a future, like I said, with democracy and, of course, against extremists and terrorists. Because we understand, we know, I think those of you who reported in the 1980s and especially in 1990s what the Taliban stand for and why. We have a young, resilient, and enterprising population, which I mentioned, who have given the opportunity and the means will achieve self-reliance both to defend and rebuild our country. Second, Afghanistan and the international community have achieved a number of milestones that we only need to build upon. And I think, the state institutions, of course, the return of so many millions of girls and boys back to school, of course, increased access to electricity, to mobile phones, to, all those achievements that we have achieved so far that must be consolidated in order to secure Afghanistan. And I think, third, I'll be done soon, after 8 years of learning by doing, there are many, many lessons to be learned from our collective past mistakes for the way forward. Above all, we know that if our nation partners do not coordinate their civil and military efforts, or if they do not put Afghan ants, enough of Afghan face, we need Afghan ants, on every project by helping Afghans design, we need to be assisted to design and implement it ourselves. Success is not going to be sustainable in Afghanistan. 9 years is a long time, and most countries are now the institutional memory. They need to avoid repeating the past mistakes. So with that, the Afghan government, of course, organized a Kabul conference for the first time, international conference on Afghanistan in Kabul on July 20th. And our former finance minister, Ashraf Ghani, was in charge of that. And he came up with, of course, a number of very strategic solutions in terms of both the strategic internal coordination among 24 Afghan ministries through 4 or 5 clusters, and as well as also with the international community, but of course with a request that in the next 2 years the international community must channel at least 50% of their resources through Afghan state institutions, and at the same time achieve an 80% alignment rate of their independent aid efforts to of course align with our the priorities of the Afghanistan national development strategy. So what I really heard, just my quick reactions from at least 2 of my colleagues on the reconciliation with the Taliban, is that, indirectly arguing that, of course, this is not going to work out. So whatever I said here, especially in terms of what Afghans want, Afghans don't matter. That's essentially what I heard. That's essentially what I heard. That we need to just find a solution, whatever that solution is, just label it an Afghan solution, just, try to put an end to this because it's not going to work out. The fact is that it's going to work out. The fact is, I mentioned all those key opportunities in Afghanistan. It's a matter of time. It's a matter of correcting the strategy. It's a matter of resourcing the strategy, and it's a matter of putting Afghan hands on the implementation of that strategy. As in each sector, you phase out, we phase in. As you withdraw, we continue to rebuild and secure Afghanistan with your continued, of course, with continued and enduring strategic partnership, especially with the United States, because that's what the Afghan people really count as far as we are concerned. So we do not reject, of course, reconciliation or reintegration. The Afghan government is working on that. We have, of course, now adopted it as a policy. We are working with Japan, which is funded part of the reintegration trust fund. But it has to be, again, implemented as a part of a comprehensive strategy based on our conditions. When we say that the Taliban must accept the Afghan constitution, then they must accept the constitution, and we must have the resources and the capability to enforce the language of the Afghan constitution. Or when we ask that they must give up violence and lay down their weapons, we must be assisted to really follow through and implement that. We shouldn't just bring people by simply their verbal agreement that we will, yes, do it, but once they are in the government, then I'm not sure what will happen. The Afghan people are not sure what will happen. I don't know, some of my colleagues are talking to Afghans, which Afghans they're talking about. I'm talking to every segment of the Afghan society, the 95% of the Afghan society, including some of the Taliban who are joining, just fighting as a rental Taliban. Their hearts and minds are with the government. Their hearts and minds are with the world community. But they will, of course, continue fighting if we do not deliver, if we continue betraying them, if we come up with quick fixes and shortcuts. That's where I think the Afghan people will not be with us. But they are with us to the extent that we see poll after poll after poll. Still, 70% of the Afghans are with us, and they have basic demands and expectations. So with that, I'll take your more specific questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashraf. Thanks to everybody on the panel. It was really extraordinary. I think one of my takeaways from this panel from the day is that there are solutions. They're difficult. There's a lot of heavy lifting, but there are regional solutions. They're very complex. They need more leadership in the region, not less. They need more investment in the region, not less. And they need to be owned by the people of the region and not imposed from the outside. But what I fundamentally take away from this is that there is a way forward, and the way forward today is to ask two burning questions from the floor, and then we're going to wrap up for the day. So, David, why don't you lead off?
Hey, it's a quick question. I guess it's to Mr. Barrett and to Michael. I hear a lot of people talking about the reconciliation process with the Taliban, and I've been involved in some of those discussions myself. I always ask people the same question. What about the Northern Alliance? We've got Amrullah talking smack up in the Panjshir. We've got tribes rearming. We've got people moving their money offshore. What if we come to the point where we can make a deal with the Taliban? Doesn't that just bring them off the bench fighting again? How are we integrating the idea of all Afghans having some kind of interest in the outcome of the negotiations? What I see, and I know I don't put you guys in this bucket, but I see people thinking, oh, it's just as simple as making a deal with the Taliban. But there are other key players out here, I think, and I'd be interested in your take on that.
Well, I think it's a key question, and I think the thing is, it comes down to what I said at the end, is that what we have to do is create space for Afghans themselves to come forward with solutions, because everybody is very aware of that danger of the civil strife starting again if the settlement is imbalanced, and therefore without the Afghans themselves, you know what it's like in Afghanistan, how good they are, how pragmatic they are indeed at discussing among themselves, whether at local, community, regional, or whatever level. As soon as you introduce outside influences, that becomes very, very difficult. So my projection, if you like, would be to do whatever we can to just provide them space, and that may be stopping the aggressive operations.
Dave, it's good to ask that. I mean, I obviously have a longer list of what's new in 2010 relative to 2009, and one of them is that the saber rattling in the north, and the sort of the talk of the outlandish schemes of, oh well, maybe we could have some separate deal north of the Hindu Kush. That's happened over the past few months. I think that the point. The point of my sort of talking about the default option and sort of if there isn't some kind of effective political process, what happens is saying, of course, there will be sustained conflict, and there'll be a limiting of what can be achieved inside the country, which is not good for the constituencies north of the Hindu Kush either. I mean, it's an Afghanistan which basically is frustrated, isn't able to deliver. There is the potential for being part of a successful Afghanistan, which is functioning Afghan pluralism, can be good both to those constituencies that the Taliban have mobilized and those constituencies that the Northern Alliance has mobilized. But this is why we talk about there has to be a political process leading up to any kind of deal. That the diplomacy is not just diplomacy talking around talking with a few sort of militants in the hills or Pakistan. Very much is about a conversation in Afghan society, including those people who have mobilized the population in the north as well.
Okay, Peter.
Thanks for everybody for your very great contributions. There's a lot of academic work on how insurgencies end, and there's usually three preconditions. One is a mutual recognition of military stalemate. Two, a mutual recognition of legitimate claims on either side, even if grudging. And three, trusted mediators and the expectation of good faith negotiations. And this also goes to you, Ashraf. I mean, to what extent are those conditions satisfied now in Afghanistan? And if they aren't being satisfied, how might they be satisfied in the future?
Recognition of military stalemate is no longer there. Some people talk about it, but the point is that there is a militarist faction in both sides that believes they can achieve a bit more on the battlefield. So we're not there. In terms of the legitimate claims, it's sort of funny because actually when we Richard quite rightly presented presented sort of three main demands of the senior insurgent figures that he's talking about, and I think you could have added to that. There is always some kind of general talk about imposition of Sharia, or at least the system must be adequately Islamic, or we must have a chance to stamp it and saying we now approve it as being adequately Islamic. I mean, actually, you can almost take out that that point in your list of three because there's not much to talk about in the substantive demands. But then the third one, obviously, the mediator, I think you probably have to look at that very carefully. A mediator or a process whereby mediation can happen. I've been very taken by the response from the otherwise, the more reasonable parts of the Taliban. When you ask them about their response to the High Peace Council, they say it's a slap in the face, because they say we understand that there has to be a mediation process, but they say in Afghanistan there is always a tradition of a salis, who is somebody who is essentially neutral, who talks to the different sides, extracts some concessions, imposes some conditions, and brings them together. At the moment, nobody is empowered to do that in Afghanistan, and I think that as you do get real movement towards ending the conflict, that's one of the things which is probably going to change. Now, quite how it's going to work, we'll see. But the architecture is not yet present, and what we have at the moment is just sort of opening bids, not the real thing.
I'm going to ask one final question and take the chair's prerogative, and it's to Claire and to anyone else who wants to take a shot. In the four-level framework that you laid out, it requires considerable leadership on many dimensions of the problem simultaneously. Where are we seeing the leadership coming from to achieve the regional dimensions as well as the internal dimensions? Who's taking the lead on this? Is this going to be done by committee? Is this going to be done by task force? Is a mediator, a super empowered mediator, going to arise? Where do you see the leadership emerging? What's your hope?
Excellent question, and I think it's still an open question. I think we've all learned to stop over-personalizing. And for too long, I think we've treated Afghanistan as if it consists of one man, President Karzai. And, all due respect to President Karzai, he's the elected representative of the country, but there are 28 million Afghans. And similarly, there are many other capable leaders at all levels of government in the US on the ground. I think certainly President Obama put a very clear signal that that he's put his confidence in General Petraeus and his leadership on the ground, and General Petraeus himself recognises and has sought a civil partnership with Ambassador Eikenberry and with others. I've certainly been heartened by the leadership abilities and the articulation of the problem and potential solutions by the UN representative Stefan de Mistura, who has an optimistic nature and a confidence, a deep belief that any solution going forwards must be based on what Afghans want and a framework for Afghans. But in answer, I think that question really is an open question at the moment, needs to be defined.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to take a shot?
Patrick, I think as Claire mentioned, it's a very good open question. Who's going to lead into this solution? I agree. I see all entities have the good intention. They're all working together, contributing. What I wanted to really say is that although this is a question that requires contribution from internal politics of Afghanistan, transnational issues considered, international contributions, all of that, but at the end of the day, I believe it is the Afghans who have to own up to the leadership, I think, and say, this is what I want. I think, Ashraf, you've asked the question, and this is something that I've seen over and over when I talk to people here and everywhere, is that what do Afghans want? And at one point, I can see, for example, on the points that have been put forward today on many grounds, on security, on prosperity, very clear want list. I haven't seen one. If there is one, then I'd be very interested in seeing one.
I think we have done that from the very beginning, and I think how many meetings I've attended with President Karzai, how many meetings I've attended with so many different ministers they've come here, how many meetings just this past week I've attended with ministers who've discussed our ideas, our aspirations, our plans, how many documents we've presented, and some of which you've been involved with Dr. Ghani, beginning from the National Development Framework to Securing the Future of Afghanistan we presented in Berlin, and then the document, the Afghanistan Compact and the London Conference, the first round, 2006, and then, of course, the second one in January, and then the very last one, just a couple of months ago on July 20th. I go around, I attend talks, attend meetings and talk to some of my colleagues in the government, coalition governments. Have you read this? Have you heard about this? They say no. We don't know about this, or some of this is just an academic exercise. Well, then the very last, paper that Dr. Ghani did as coordinator of the Kabul conference was referred to as an academic exercise, and they said, well, it was done by the Department of State. They said, no, I know the person who has worked on this. We've been very clear, and President Karzai has been very clear. When I think the international community gets stuck and cannot get rid of the problems and the standard practices and so forth, like I mentioned, with internal, regional, transnational, and international challenges, of course, then they blame it on Afghanistan. When it's their problem, it becomes our sovereignty, where immediately a positive sovereign nation. When President Karzai, for example, asked that these security contractors must be dismantled because they're destabilizing Afghanistan. He's been asking that since 2005. He asked President Bush, and that was delayed. He's been asking, as early as 3 months ago, and even after he decreed, there was no attention paid to the decree. The specific, clear reasons as to why. But unfortunately, Afghans, there's so much that Afghans can do, and can say, but if we're not just listened to, if we're not given the capacity and the resources to implement policies, to implement strategies, if Afghan hands are not put, if those Afghan brains that are working with NGOs and UN agencies and Afghan doctors, for God's sake, are working as interpreters, translators for the forces of different countries in Afghanistan, then which Afghans we're talking about? The 95% of Afghans are people who are desperate, who are illiterate, who are poor, who are just thinking about their survival day to day, including Pashtuns in the south and east. And let's also be clear that Pashtuns are not the Taliban, and not all Taliban are Pashtuns. To the extent that Pashtuns passively support the Taliban is because of their, deprivation and the kind of status they're living in. And so just again, going back to the problem of narcotics.
Actually, we need to close down before we go down to narcotics. Yeah. It's the end of the day. I don't want to abuse our friendships with the people in the room. But I want to thank the entire panel. Please join me in thanking everyone here.